A city councilman faces murder charges in Washington after police accused him of killing his much younger girlfriend. This week, he entered a not guilty plea in court. We're going to dig into the charging documents with Seattle attorney Anne Bremner. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey, everybody, this is a Law&Crime legal alert. Google Incognito tracked users' browsing data without their knowledge. Yep, well, Mass Tort Alliance, one of our legal sponsors, is helping users file for compensation due to Google misleading the privacy of their incognito browser. So if you've used Google Incognito anytime since 2016, you can start your claim in less than 10 questions at incognitoclaims.com/sidebar. James McNeal Jr. seemed to be a pillar of his community in Bothell, Washington. Served on the city council for 8 years. He'd been in the construction business. It's our understanding he even helped create a charity to foster relationships between police and young people in the area. But earlier this month, the 58-year-old McNeal was arrested and charged with murder. Murder after being found at his 20-year-old girlfriend's home, and she was dead in the bedroom upstairs. Liliya Guyvoronsky was found naked, face down in her bed. She was covered up by bedding. Police documentation indicates McNeal's own attorney called 911. Think about that for a second, saying his client was inside the home. There had likely been a homicide. First responders believe that Liliya had been dead for a while. Investigators are still waiting on autopsy results to determine when exactly she died and how she was killed. For now, it appears that she was suffocated. Investigators believe that she likely died sometime between April 28th, when neighbors last reported seeing her, and April 30th, when she was found. According to police, as well as what friends and family have told local media outlets, Liliya met McNeal when she was working at a Seattle strip club. McNeal reportedly had separated from his wife he shared children with. He lost his bid for re-election to the city council last year. He had served 2 terms. McNeal and Liliya apparently had been in an on-again, off-again relationship for some time, with McNeal reportedly funding her lifestyle so she could maybe quit her job. They reportedly had a fight just days before she was killed. Liliya's friend Madison Darner told KIRO7 in Seattle she was 20 years old and she was young. She was figuring out her life. And she was a beautiful and talented young woman. She cared for every single person, and the intention behind her actions was so sincere and genuine. No one deserves to be murdered like that. I want to bring in right now Seattle attorney Anne Bremner. You have a lot of experience in these kinds of domestic violence cases, and it's good to see you. It's been some time. Right off the bat, it has.
Yeah, great to see you.
Good to see you. Right off the bat, how do you react to this story, since it's not necessarily in your neighborhood, but, you know, it's in your state?
Well, and she actually was in South Seattle, which is more in my neighborhood here in Seattle. But it's shocking to see somebody that served on the city council, not 1, but 2 terms, and had, at least up until now, you know, a crime-free life, you know, family, everything else, to be arrested like this was a pretty shocking headline. Especially when his lawyer called in and said that there's a homicide in that house. And, of course, there he was with the body.
Let's get to that in a minute, because I'm made of questions when it comes to that. But right. I want to go through these charging documents with you. So McNeal was charged with murder in the 2nd degree. I believe that carries up to life in prison. The prosecutor stated in the filing, quote, that the defendant, James Gregory McNeal Jr. in King County, Washington, on or about the period between April 28th, 2024 and April 30th, 2024, while committing and attempting to commit the crime of assault in the 2nd degree, and in the course of and in furtherance of said crime, and in the immediate flight therefrom, and with intent to cause the death of another person, did cause the death of Liliya A. Guyvoronsky, a human being who was not a participant in said crime, and who died between April 28th, April 30th. Now, assault in the 2nd degree, as used in the above charge, means to intentionally assault another by strangulation or suffocation. His bond was set at $3 million. So, and my question is, the way I understand it, is for there to be 2nd degree murder, you either need the intent to kill, but you don't need premeditation, but the intent to kill. Right. But also, if you're committing a felony, like an assault and someone dies, that could be 2nd degree murder. Do I have that right?
You have it exactly right. And in our state, we have the underlying felony of assault, too. If that's committed, it could be by strangulation or grievous bodily harm assault. You're going to have murder, too, in certain circumstances. And that's the way they charge it here. And then, of course, with murder, too, You don't have premeditation like lying in wait, but you have intent to kill. So you can charge in the alternative.
So in other words, if he were to say, listen, we got into a fight, I got aggressive, he wouldn't be able to argue, I don't know, you tell me, would he be able to argue manslaughter, or does he have to say, I had nothing to do with this, I wasn't there, I didn't put my hands on her?
Yeah, I mean, he can't say that because he was found with her body. I mean, that'd be a pretty tough defense, right?
Yeah,
On
yeah.
Lisa. Although he was silent after his lawyer said he's not going to talk, and he didn't talk after he was arrested by Seattle police. But basically, with you have strangulation, that is actually assault too in our state. And an interesting thing, just as a side note, our Supreme Court threw out assault too as an underlying offense for murder too some time back. But then the legislature fixed some things, and now it's back in as an underlying felony for two.
Yeah, that's I can understand that. I can understand why you would do that. Because if you're going to engage in that kind of violent attack and someone dies, it makes sense. But let me talk to you about McNeal's attorney, because this is really, really interesting. So his attorney was the one who made the call to 911 to report that something very bad had happened inside this South Seattle home. Jan Olson, the attorney, called Seattle police on April 30th. Part of the 911 phone call transcript was included in the charging documents. I'll read it right here. Olson says, I'm an attorney. I am reporting what is likely a homicide. I represent someone inside the residence and am making the call. I have not gone inside. I am outside of the residence. When the dispatcher asked if Olson knew the relationship between his client and the person he believed was dead in the home, Olson said, I cannot comment further. I am here to assist this person as an attorney, and I'm authorized to share this in order to have law enforcement become involved. Now, Anne, you actually know Jan Olson?
I do. I just finished a case with Jan where we both represented the same individual. He had the criminal case and I had the civil. And I've known him for decades. He's a great lawyer, very ethical, very, very careful. And my guess, I mean, just from what he said, is that the accused at that point asked him to make that call. And so that's what he did.
Okay. Is that the only way that could have happened? Or does he say, my client just told me that he strangled someone and I'm going to call law enforcement? Because the attorney-client relationship, the attorney-client privilege could be kind of interesting there. If his client called him and said, I just strangled someone, I don't know if she's dead or not. She might be dead, but I just strangled her, or someone. Does he have an obligation to call law enforcement?
You know, I think he does in that circumstance under our ethical rules in Washington, especially if you don't know if she's dead or not. And so the fact is, if someone can come in and rescue her, then I think he has that obligation. I was surprised. I don't think he identified himself, did he? But they had the identification on the call, some way to identify the caller.
Yeah,
at any rate.
He said, I'm an attorney. I don't know if he gave his full name, but yeah. Right.
But it sounds like the body had been there for some time.
Yeah.
So it kind of begs the question about, was there some emergency or something like that? So I think
because let's be clear, it's an ongoing threat, ongoing crime. If a murder had already happened and there's a dead body, he wouldn't necessarily have to call police, right? Walk us through that.
Exactly. And that's why I think he must have had the go-ahead from his client to make that call. His client's sitting there for days, I don't know, hours, and then calls his lawyer and says, listen, somebody needs to report this. I'm sitting here. And so Jan makes the call. That's the way I would think it happened. But only Jan knows, and only that defendant knows. Because
your client could confess to you, I know where the bodies are, or I did this, but you wouldn't be under a legal obligation to then report it to the police. That's attorney-client privilege.
I know, and there's some tough cases on that, as you know, Jesse, over the years.
Yeah.
On that ethical obligation and how families wait for answers, and attorneys don't give those often in certain cases based on the privilege.
I'm starting to think that, I think you're right, that he must have gotten the green light from Mr. McNeal to call police, because if this was already a homicide, this was already a dead body, he wouldn't have had an obligation to do that. Okay, so right. Olson calls the police. They send out officers, and this is what they find. This is according to the charging documents. The police responded. The defendant was immediately taken into custody as he exited the victim's home. Evidence from the residents and the victim's family show that the defendant and this victim had been in a dating relationship that lasted several months, and that he was likely supporting her financially, estimated at approximately $10,000 a month. At the time police made entry into the home, the victim was laying naked in her bed, her safe space, as she had described it to her mother, having been deceased for some time. Observed around the residence were handwritten notes reminding her not to have contact with the defendant, describing him as mentally and emotionally abusive, and recording details as to how he made her feel so that she would not forget it. Photographs of McNeal and Guyvoronsky together in various locations, as well as several handwritten lists believed to be authored by Guyvoronsky, were found throughout her residence. One such note was dated April 29th, 2024, best described as a to-do list, had several items listed, including at the very bottom, "Do not interact with James today." Another note with similar handwriting indicates, "Make sure you do not forget how you felt, the anger, hurt, neglect from James, knowing you are struggling, does not care, dismissing any attempts to ask for help, demanding sex, demanding access to everything. Example, key to home." And talk to me about these notes.
Well, they're just devastating. I mean, coercive control, of course, is the phrase we use with domestic violence cases. And she's in chapter and verse laying that out to herself, but also to us today and the prosecutors and potentially jury in the future as to what she was going through. I mean, she had worked, and then he was paying her $10,000 a month, and she didn't work. And yet, she was all conflicted because he was controlling, he was abusive, and she was reminding herself daily, don't fall for this guy. And she even talked about how he would get abusive, she would give him the silent treatment, and then he would love bomb her and have her come back, gifts, dresses, things like that, and money. But she wanted out of that cycle. But then she ended up dead. We know how cycle of violence can oftentimes end this way. And just one other side note, in the O.J. Simpson case, we just saw, at least I recently saw, that Nicole Brown Simpson had quite a journal similar to this that never came into evidence.
So, in other words, you see this in the kinds of cases you've covered, these domestic violence cases where there's somebody in the relationship leaving themselves notes, reminding them about what happened. So, when you heard that detail, you weren't necessarily surprised to hear it.
No, and I've also seen somebody like the Susan Cox Powell case that I had, where she actually did a last will and testament saying, "If I die, my husband did it," and she put it in a safe deposit box. And she was right.
Now, when police took McNeal out of the home, it goes on to state the court filing, officers observed that McNeal had both fresh and dried blood on his clothing, a deep laceration on his right wrist, and a couple of other lacerations on his left wrist. Mr. Olson advised that Mr. McNeal would not say anything to officers. McNeal was identified by his Washington State driver's license. Officers believe that McNeal may have been attempting to take his own life, so they took him to a hospital. And how does that aspect factor into the case?
I guess it could get him some sympathy, but not really. I mean, in this kind of a case, there was even a vigil yesterday for her because some folks were saying she was denigrated because she'd quote unquote been a stripper before this. And a lot of people are talking about what a wonderful person she was, her family as her friends, her neighbors, etc. And so maybe he did try and do that, but again, how's that going to help him in a trial? He's facing murder 2 charges with potentially, like you said, life in prison and a $50,000 fine, or both.
Well, I imagine he could say, "I was so distraught at seeing her body. This is what I did." But I really think it goes to consciousness of guilt, right? In your experience, if someone tries to, there's one thing for trying to escape, but if someone tries to take their own life, sometimes that can be used to prove that they committed the crime.
Right. And I was going back to the O.J. Simpson case. Why didn't they bring that out when he wrote what looked like a suicide note? They didn't. I thought that they should have. And I think in this case, it would be important. We had a stock brief, and I was a prosecutor, called "Evidence of Flight is Evidence of Guilt." I mean, it's so obvious that comes in. And the fact that he wanted to take his own life, that does show, like you said, consciousness of guilt. And then he finally calls his lawyer because he's just been sitting there stewing after he did try and kill himself. But apparently that was a pretty futile effort from what I can tell from the injuries.
Now, he was supposed to appear in court for the first time for a bail hearing in the days after, but he was a no-show. He waived his right to appear in court. That's when the judge set that $3 million bond. He finally appeared on Tuesday, didn't say anything. His attorney entered a not guilty plea for him. His next court date in June, plans for a trial in July. What do you make of that, not showing up?
I kind of look at someone like this and think that he's just being a manipulator. I mean, he could show up. He wasn't unable physically to show up. And he did look pretty bad in those pictures and the videos that I saw from yesterday. But all you do, at least in my state, is you can only enter a plea of not guilty at that stage.
Right.
Nothing's going to happen calendar. So he wasn't really avoiding anything.
Anne Bremner, thank you so much for coming on. Really disturbing case, but appreciate your insight as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. As always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.